Hey everyone, I'm going to go through some notes today about testable questions as we work towards being able to design our own scientific experiments. One of the next steps after we've made some observations and learned a little bit about living and non living things is to figure out how to turn our observations into questions, and specifically questions that we can test and come up with an answer through a scientific process or an experiment. So you'll need to prepare your either paper or electronic notes in order to write down a few things today. You don't have to set these up as Cornell style notes. These can just be written down in your own way. There's just a few definitions and a couple of examples. So they're pretty short, but we're going to go through these and then we will be using these in one of our next lessons. So this would be one of the slides that I'd like for you to write down. And really what this shows us is a comparison between the types of questions that we can ask and the types of ways we can find answers to questions, right? And so as it says here, if we ask a question that involves doing research, right, a research question, that might be something that we look up online or in a book or ask someone who's an expert about that area. A different way to find an answer to a question would be to observe something related to it. And we might do that simply by looking at it or counting things or measuring things. Other types of questions are simply opinion-based questions, and those answers are going to be based on individual or personal preference, right? The answers might vary to those. And finally, we have what are called testable questions, where we can design an experiment in order to determine the answer. And the most important part of a testable question is that we can collect data on that question, and the data will help us determine a conclusion. So in your notes, you can write down this chart and the question at the top there in blue in order to make these comparisons and sort of know the difference between these types of questions. And as it says at the bottom there also, just remember that there are some types of questions that are really unanswerable. They're even beyond the opinion or personal preference, right? So we're going to focus in, though, on that last type, testable scientific questions. So feel free to pause the video here if you need to continue writing down, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right, so these will be a few slides that you do not have to write down. These are just sort of for thinking purposes, right? So how would you answer these questions? What is the effect of changing the food a caterpillar eats on how big it grows? How could we answer that, right? We might give it a variety of types of food, measure it at the beginning, measure it at the end. So as you can see, that involves some of the parts we talked about on the slide before of collecting data, doing measurements and observations. Versus this question, how would you answer this one? Is this caterpillar a girl or a boy? Well, I don't know. I would probably have to look it up in terms of what to look for. Maybe it has to do with coloring, size, patterns, features of the body. But that one would not necessarily be a testable question. That would be more of a research question. So again, you do not have to write these ones down. This is just for thinking and discussion purposes. So notice, and we just talked about this, what makes them different is the fact that we could test the first question, right? And as we said, the second question is much more of a research question. We would just sort of need to look something up and then make some observations on the caterpillar about it. So again, you don't need to write these down either, but let's think these ones through. How would you answer these questions? What effect does changing the type of fertilizer added to the trees have on the amount of apples that grow? And then how about this question? How long does it take before an apple tree can produce fruit? So now what types of questions do these seem like? Well, the first one, we could definitely set up an experiment. So this we're going to call a testable question. We could have the same types of apple trees, a couple of them, and give them different amounts or types of fertilizers and count the number of apples that grow. Data collection coming to a conclusion. The second one, we could simply observe or do research about. That one is probably already known and we could look it up. All right, so at this point in the notes here, I'm not going to discuss these ones, but I do want you to view each of these yellow practice slides and think them through. And what we'll do in our lesson tomorrow is I'll call on a few of you in order to describe these. Okay, so it says, which of these questions makes a better testable question and why? So I would want you to be able to tell us and then explain your thinking on that. So which of these is better testable question? Which brand of chewing gum is the best? Which brand of chewing gum keeps its flavor the longest? Okay, so again, think those through now, and we'll talk about them in tomorrow's lesson and have one of you explain. How about this one here? Which is a better testable question and why? What effect does water temperature in ice cube trays have on the time it takes to make ice cubes? How do I make ice cubes freeze better? And how long does it take to make an ice cube? Okay, think those through. Here's some more examples. Which of these is a better testable question and why? How long does it take a mouse to complete one run of a maze? What will cause a mouse to move faster through a maze? Apples, peanut butter, or cheese? And what is the best food for mice? All right. So this is a slide I would like you to write down. Okay, so in terms of a definition, what is a testable question? A testable question is one that can be answered by designing and conducting an experiment, and then data is collected and analyzed. Okay, so add this to your notes, please, and this will sort of be our definition of what a testable question is. Again, feel free to pause here. I'm going to move on. Okay, so in addition to that definition, testable questions are always about changing only one thing to measure what the effect is on another thing. Okay, if we change too many things in what we're trying to do, we won't know which one is affecting the outcome. So in testable questions, in scientific experiments, we really need to change only one thing at a time to measure it and determine its effect. Okay, so please write this down underneath your definition of testable questions. This is an important point to know about them. All right, so here's an example testable question, right? You could write this down, please, under your definition as well. Does changing the height of the ramp affect the speed of the car going down the ramp? Now, if you think about what we wrote previously, where it said we're changing only one thing, that's what's highlighted in yellow here, changing the height of the ramp. And what we're trying to determine whether or not it affects is the speed of the car. All right. I believe this is the last thing to write down here in your notes for today, please. Some testable question formats. When we write a testable question, we want to keep in mind the changing one thing and the effect on one thing. And so there are a couple of ways you can do that. One format you could do would be, does changing blank affect blank? Another way would be, how does changing blank affect blank? Or we can take a little bit more of an I don't know approach, but we want to figure out if there will be an effect. If I change blank, will it affect blank? Okay, so those would be three ways. And we're going to use these as we go back to our observations you made the other day, and try to turn our observations into testable questions using these. So please add this slide here to your notes, and I believe this should be the last part we need to write down today. All right. So here's an example at the end of our notes for today. And again, I'm not going to give the answer to this because I want one of you in our lesson tomorrow to be able to talk through this. So is this a testable question? Why or why not? What makes plants grow best? Okay, so I'm actually just going to leave it there, and then we'll come back to this tomorrow. You already saw the answer, but we need to think about why. All right.